Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring something we all intuitively understand, and which, if you're launching a product or service, can be absolutely critical to your success or failure. And that is timing. As the expression goes, timing is everything. But what makes the right time? We've all heard of products that failed, only for someone to resurrect the same idea at a later date, and for it to be wildly successful. Equally, people have launched things that were once good ideas, but no longer are. How do we know when the time is right? Well, today's guest who's going to help me answer that question has been on the show before. Paul Orlando first came on during the early days of the pandemic. He's an expert in unintended consequences and systems thinking, and advises startups in how they can be more successful. He's joining me on the show to talk about his brand new book on timing and the crucial role it plays in the success of startups and innovation. Why now? How good timing makes great products. Explores the idea that timing can be the decisive factor in whether an idea takes off or falls flat. In our discussion, we dive deep into why timing matters so much, and Paul shares insights from historical case studies such as AT&T's early missteps in the mobile phone market and the rise of YouTube, to illustrate how timing has played a critical role in shaping their outcomes. And we'll explore the frameworks and methodologies that Paul has developed to help entrepreneurs and innovators identify the right moment to launch their product or service. So whether you're an entrepreneur looking to bring a new product to market, an investor evaluating the potential of startups, or just someone like me who's fascinated by the dynamics of innovation, this conversation is insightful and thought-provoking. You'll hear practical strategies for analysing timing and making informed decisions that can be the difference between success and failure. So please enjoy, as I know you will because he's always great value, my discussion with Paul Orlando on the importance of timing. Paul, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
Christian, thanks for having me back on. Great to see you again.
I am so excited to have you back on, Paul, because I was looking, you were one of the early guests on the show back when we were all locked into our homes and not being able to go anywhere, very different world. And we met through the subject of unintended consequences, which is how I'd originally come across you. And I'll put a link to the episode and obviously all the work that you do in that space there. But you've moved on to do something completely different. And it's obviously different in the sense of what we see, but I think is entirely consistent with your piece. So talk to us about this new idea. You've been looking at timing.
Right. And I almost consider this an extension of what I was doing those years ago on the unintended consequences or on systems, back when we first spoke. But I do have this new book out on timing, or on the why now question, as it's also, often termed. And a couple of reasons behind that. So the day job, what I do, that you might not know so much about is I work with a lot of startups. I work with corporates, say on innovation programs. And I see a lot of companies, and especially now over the years, I've seen a lot of new products be spun up, many of which just don't work out. Now, sometimes that's because of an issue with the team, or it's an issue with just, maybe an inability to execute. But there's other situations where something either really takes off or doesn't, and it's not related to, the individuals and how they are working. Instead, it's really based on this timing question. And what you'll find if you talk to people who invest in startups or who are, involved in innovation, they will certainly talk about how timing is important. In fact, timing is often recognized as one of those, one of the top reasons that something becomes successful or fails. But I never really saw anybody dive deeply into this topic. And so that's what I have attempted to do in this book.
And I love that. You're absolutely right. If one thinks about any sort of investor pitches that people do, there is that page marked why. There's all the sort of why it should be us and why it's a great thing, but there is that focus on why now. And I think it's kind of interesting because, to your point, it is a critical factor, because ultimately what we're dealing with here is you have to have the right idea, you have to have the right people doing it. But then that timing thing does become really key, and it plays quite a major role. And I think we all intuitively understand this. We've all missed the bus, for example, right? So we know that timing matters hugely. I can think about it as a personal thing where, what the French called l'esprit d'escalier, the idea that you could have said something really witty and smart in the moment, but you've
And you
remembered
think of
it
it later
halfway up the
on.
step.
Right.
So we all understand intuitively that timing matters, but you're right. It's interesting because we don't spend too much time thinking about it. We use it as an excuse. Right? Oh, my
Exactly.
timing was just off, right? And almost as a way of saying it's not my fault. The timing was just wrong, but everything else was
Right.
brilliant. So there's this major
So
thing, but we haven't looked at the underlying a lot, as you say.
no, it's so true, and it's often used as really a way to feel a little better about ourselves. Oh, I was just too early. I was ahead of my time, right? Years later, you see someone else do something pretty similar, and it really takes off. And it's almost like, oh, well, I actually did think of it, but I was just too early, so I can still feel good. And then there's also, another quote that's relevant is Kierkegaard's, famous quote, life must be lived forwards, but can only be understood backwards. So there's that other question that I was kind of struggling with. Well, can we really only appreciate timing in retrospect? Can we do anything to get some clues that might say, okay, I'm not predicting the future, but if I had to maybe place some bets, I'm going to, bet in this way because I expect it's becoming more likely that something's going to happen. And therefore I want to kind of play in that area. Or maybe, like if I have limited time, limited resources, I want to put them in certain areas. So yeah, I think we can get some clues to figure that out. I caution people against thinking that I'm trying to predict the future, which I'm not trying to do. But my process in doing this was basically, I kind of had this very messy anecdotal set of experiences over the years with hundreds of startups, and then also a good number of corporates, and that was kind of the ground level of me starting to think about this. And then I really went back into some of the historical literature and looked at a number of famous at the time products that I had never heard of, including at companies I had worked for, where billions of dollars had been invested and lost, and they are now like a footnote in the history of failed products. But I combined those direct experiences and and some of the research, and then ended up coming out with a bit of a format and some frameworks that I think are helpful for people who are trying to figure things out. Like, is this the right time for this product to be invested in? We have 10 potential internal projects that we are considering spinning up. Where should we put resources? That type of thing.
And of course, it's really interesting, right? Because it is significant. It doesn't matter if everything else falls into place and the timing is wrong, that's an issue. So in a way, this ought to be a basic test that's applied a bit more sophisticatedly than just some blurb on a slide deck, actually, that we do need to think about these things. You talked about the famous case studies that obviously there's the really well-known stuff that bombed the first time, and then you've got your anecdotal ones. How did you go about identifying what the factors were?
So a lot of it was just a very natural process, I'd say, just like observing what I saw happen in different situations. And I'll go so far as to say, I don't think I'm doing anything that is going to be surprising to people. It's just that I kind of put some different things together and made it, I think, a little more of a method as opposed to, well, this kind of feels right or doesn't feel right. So I'll give you an example. And this is one where I actually spoke to people who were in the room when this decision was made. But years ago, I worked at AT&T. And, AT&T's history in the U.S. was as the monopoly telecom carrier. Like, that's the bulk of the history of that company. And it used to be a much more significant company than it is today, certainly. And, it was famous for Bell Labs, invented the transistor, the dial tone, mobile telephony, a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted today, we don't even associate them, with that company. But even when I was there, and this is a while back, some of the old timers there would once in a while reference something that they called the study. So just the study. So from that, it's got to be bad, right? It's like there's not even like any description. It's just the study. And this was a reference to way before my time, but a study that McKinsey Consulting had done for AT&T in the early 1980s. And it was about, should AT&T continue investing in the mobile telephony, market, or should they exit that market? And the question posed by AT&T was, what is the market size for mobile phones going to be in the year 2000? Now, easy for us to look back from 2024 and say, well, obviously it's going to be a massive number. You've got to stay in this market, of course. Like you actually created, a lot of the networking technologies, that mobile networks rely on and mobile telephony relies on. So obviously you're going to stay in that market. And the process that McKinsey took, and I think it was a little more complicated because maybe there's a little bit of a political angle as well, was we're going to go out, we're going to survey thousands of people. We're going to ask them, hey, you've never experienced using a mobile phone before. What do you think about this? Would you like to use such a device? And the feedback that they got was overwhelmingly, no, I don't want to do that. Why would I want to? I'm going to talk to somebody when I'm walking, down the street? That's ridiculous. Right? So they came back and basically said, apart from traveling salespeople and maybe truck drivers, there's really no market for this. In fact, not even 1 million people in the entire US will want a mobile phone by the year 2000. It doesn't matter if you make it cheaper. People just don't want to do this. And based on the results of this study, and I actually spoke to someone who had the printout of the presentation in his hands, on this Zoom call that we did. Based on this study, AT&T exits that market, which is a colossal mistake, of course. In retrospect, it seems ridiculous. How would you possibly do this? And this example, for me, summarizes the way we have to change our thinking when we think about timing. So for the listeners on this podcast, depending on your age, you might not really know what the state of the art was for mobile telephony in the early 1980s. Well, it was a phone that was the size of a brick, right? It weighed about 1 kilogram. It had only a 30-minute battery life. So if you're talking to somebody, you got to recharge, after 30 minutes. We're used to doing a lot of things on our phones, right? Mostly that do not involve talking. Obviously, there's no screen that you can use, and obviously no app store, and all those, there's no internet access, of course. It's really just making a phone call. And very expensive. If I remember right, adjusted for inflation, a handset was $3,000 or $4,000, and many fewer capabilities than today, of course. Per minute charges, again, something that we're not used to thinking about, pretty expensive as well. So in that mindset, you look at that device and you think, gee, I guess they're right. Who would want to use this thing? We don't have very many subscribers today. There's a lot of dead zones. If you're driving, you're going to lose a connection, right? It's really not that good. Who would want to use this today? And instead, we should think, is this as good as it's going to get? Can I imagine all of those hindrances that I just mentioned? Wow, only 30 minutes of battery life, or talk time, a really heavy handset, expensive. Are all of those things going to stay more or less static? Or do I actually think those are going to improve? And if I talk to people in the industry, I talk to people who are working on battery, technology. I talk to people who are working on miniaturization of the components that go into the phone, all those things. Could I actually get a picture on when we might see some improvements? And gee, if that device becomes radically smaller and cheaper and better, does it actually change human behavior? And I think, when I think of human risk, that I think is the mindset that it's easy to get into. It's hey, this is just the way the world is, versus, are there some things going on that could result in a different world? And therefore, should I make this decision a little differently?
And so when you're looking at timing, that's a really interesting example, right? Because you're saying, okay, based on our perspective at this point in time, all other things remaining as they are, right, we make a decision. But of course, you're saying look ahead. And so when you're thinking about timing, it's also how things might change over time. And so we're looking not just, is this a good moment in terms of people's perceptions? And we can come back, I want to come back and explore a little bit about that, because it's interesting when you ask people what they want versus what they actually want. But you're really looking at the whole thing and saying time is a really important factor here. And it's really, really, as you say, I laugh about this because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, there's Blockbuster, Netflix, there's all the classic business case studies that sort of, with the benefit of hindsight, we laugh at without recognizing in the moment it's a pretty smart thing. But you're really taking time and saying this is a dynamic we need to consider because time will change all of these factors.
Exactly.
And so that's really the focal point here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then, then some of those frameworks that I think are helpful when you're thinking through it. So my approach, and this maybe goes back to your earlier question, is as I was talking to people and looking at these examples and doing research, I ended up coming up with what I call timing drivers. So these are, in my case, I chose 12 that I kept seeing again and again. These are things that, are really most likely outside of your control. These are something, maybe it's a new technology, it's a social, or behavioral change, or it's a regulatory or a legal change, but it's something that's probably outside of your control as the innovator or the entrepreneur or the business decision maker. But you're noticing something, and that's going to impact the capabilities that you have or some of the need that's going to emerge. So that's one piece. The next piece, and this is one that I often found people would ignore. The next piece is you have to connect those timing drivers that are relevant, in your case, to the business model that you could work with in the future. So in other words, back to that old mobile phone example, 1984, this device is not really providing enough value to the typical consumer. It's way too expensive. It costs too much. We're not able to recoup enough money from it. So you have to go from that current business model to, okay, if these timing drivers are having an impact, and maybe it's the tech side or it's an economic one or it's a network side, what is going to change with that business model? So is the value we're able to create going to increase dramatically? Is the cost structure going to be reduced dramatically? There's something there that you can get a handle on. And if you're in that industry and you're talking to people, you're doing your own research, you can put some numbers there that are, I know there's some level of, okay, we can't really predict exactly how this is going to happen, but you can get some level of comfort that, okay, I think the cost structure is going to improve by this much in 2 years, something like that. And then, there's this third piece, which is you really have to reflect internally and say, are we the type of organization that can do this in the appropriate time? So during COVID, last time we spoke, there were a lot of opportunities that were suddenly created because all of a sudden everyone's locked down. You've got to do, remote work. I guess for me, that was kind of beneficial. That's the way we ended up talking, the first time. But all of a sudden, the world changes. And some companies actually said, you know what? We're not going to reconfigure everything and start producing masks or hand sanitizer or test kits because, well, is this only going to last 3 months? No, we're not going to be able to actually spin up those new product lines and have some return on that investment. And then who knows, maybe the whole thing's over by summertime, right? So there were some companies who said, we just can't act fast enough. And then there were others who said, I don't know how long this thing is going to last, but I think we can actually take advantage of this, window. Maybe it's a short window. Nobody really knows, but we're going for it. And so one of the underlying themes when I research this topic, when I talk about it, is we often hear about what's called the first mover advantage. And it's really a very misleading term. So often that first mover does not win. Often that first mover is, well, they're going into a market that's too small. They can't sustain the business. They shut down. We never hear about them. Or they just don't really understand what the customers need yet. Or the business model is really not financially sustainable. They can't make it work long term. And it's only until we see a few of those early attempts fail that people really figure things out. And then you see the successes, later on. So very high level, those are 3 steps that I would, suggest.
I love this idea of the first mover advantage. It sounds great, but actually, as you say, you have to look at the timing. Then becomes the critical thing. Are they going to be able to see this thing out? And therefore, if you're going to make an investment decision, you've got to be looking, well, how long do we need to be in this for? What can we do over time? How long is it? You're introducing a really interesting variable that the bit that I find fascinating is we all intuitively understand it. And yet we kind of, almost seems to me we write it off a little bit. We go, it's important, it's really important, but it's quite hard. So I'm not going to look at that.
Right.
And to your point is, I think we are all we all make educated guesses about how long we were often wrong, but we get better at it in some cases. But it's not like we don't understand the concept of time. And so when I look at business decisions that almost ignore it or try and wish it away, I find that really fascinating, because it seems to me that it really ought to be a fundamental part of the dynamics. And yet, if I think about scorecards and other processes that I've seen, we acknowledge time's existence because we have to, but it's almost like in the pitch meeting, you'll have a page on why now, and we've only got an hour to talk about this, right? So we recognize the constraints of time in the pitch process, but we don't think about it as the dynamics. And so I'm really intrigued that you're opening a box that's blindingly obvious, and yet it's not, right? So some of the things you've talked about there are, as you said, it's not massively sophisticated, and I mean that as a compliment, and yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, it is. And to that point, you're in that meeting and you only have a short time to discuss the overall picture to say, anything about, say, timing. What I ended up doing, so as I was learning about this, I ended up running what I called a why now session with, initially with startups, as I was kind of getting a handle on this subject, and then with the larger organizations. But I ended up, and I described this in the book, but putting together this format for how you could step through a meeting that's doing really just that. And how would you run this as? And I know, of course, and your interest is how human behavior, maybe changes the way we act or the decisions we make. But I present a format that you could follow where maybe it helps you stay a little more, a little more objective, but we pay attention to these various timing drivers, that business model association, like an internal reflection on, can we actually move fast enough or, in appropriate speed? And then the mirror image of that is, we don't just end it there. I'm going to actually add one more piece to the end of that, which I call a challenge section. So I'm actually going to try to socialize this and with others in the organization and let them challenge us back in return and say, okay, is this accurate? These numbers that we're including, do I think this is reasonable? What do I think would go wrong? So more or less, a start to finish way that you could think through timing. And so when I started doing this, and one of the pieces there is, let's actually look for some of those earlier examples that maybe failed from the past, people who were doing something similar, to this. What I discovered is very few people do that, at least in the startup world. At least it was surprising to me. And, maybe there's something good about that, because maybe you're not negatively impacted by thinking oh, well, it just doesn't work, I should not even try. But there's a lot that we can actually learn from some of those past examples. And I'll give you one that I had not ever heard of until I did this research. So one of the case studies I present in the book, really because everybody knows the company, but also another reason, is a case study on YouTube, when they started out and how they grew so quickly and then were acquired by Google. So I include them both because everybody knows that company, but also because there was a lawsuit that resulted in the investment memo that was written about them in 2005 or 2006 being made public. So this is data that we typically do not see about a private company. And so all the numbers are there, and how the decision was made, it's all there. And when I was doing that research then on YouTube, I kept looking into what was going on for them. And then I discovered that not that many years earlier, in fact, just about 4 years earlier, there was a .com era startup called Share Your World that was also doing user-generated content, video, content over dial-up. And so you can imagine, if you're old enough to remember dial-up internet, and the modem, sound that you would get, if you can imagine trying to do streaming video on dial-up, it was possible. It was pretty painful, But there was a startup that actually did that from 1998 to 2001. And I found this interview with the founder of that company, who years later reflected on his experience and then the later YouTube success and said, yeah, we were too early. These were all the factors that we had to deal with. Internet access, or just like bandwidth, was a serious problem for us. By the time YouTube came along, a good percentage of households were getting broadband. When that earlier startup was in existence, just the digital storage costs were significant for a large video file. By the time YouTube rolled along, those were pretty, it was pretty cheap to store large files, and and on and on. You can make that comparison. And that difference was really, we're talking like 4 years, 5 years. So we do have those situations in the world where, wow, something that was previously prohibitively expensive or impossible for some reason, all of a sudden does become possible. So that's why I like bringing in those, those earlier examples as part of this Why Now session. And it also can help us in that challenge session experience. It can help us if we're talking to someone who maybe is, maybe a little more experienced in the industry than us, and they might know more about those earlier failures than we do. It helps us understand, okay, why was the situation different back then? And why is it different today? So if I get that pushback, I can say, you're right, but you're talking about the world that existed a few years ago. This is what's different today. And you can have, I think, a much more engaging discussion in that way.
I'm horrified and yet not surprised by that idea of, well, we don't need to look back at what the idiots of yesteryear got wrong, because that's not relevant, which is interesting because it is in itself factoring in time, because you're going, the reason I'm not going to look at this stuff is because it's not relevant to me. And I presume the largest factor of that actually probably is a function of time. That was when the world was black and white and we're now living in color. And I'm not going to go back and look at that. And I think that's really interesting when I look at the context of human errors, where we are prone as a species to continually make the same mistakes. And so it really struck me as you were talking that really, in many respects, timing, if we assume that there is no such thing as a 100% original idea, then there are going to be examples of things in the past that are relevant where timing was a factor. And so actually what I think you're encouraging people to do is to go back in time. And even if it's not directly comparable, there's probably something we can learn from that. And so in rejecting that model, we are recognizing time in of itself.
That is so nicely put. That's so nicely put. So I think that's really it. And this is maybe speaking more to me individually, but I really like learning about these earlier examples because it's also, I think it's kind of inspiring. Like, wow, people were able to pull off that, kind of thing, 100 years ago. And I would have thought that was impossible. And wow, how have things changed today? Oh, actually, this is, a much better business today than it was back then. And yet, like, there was some company founder, some innovator, some garage scientist kind of working on this thing and proving, okay, we have that capability. Unfortunately, there's no business model that sustains it, but it is possible to do this thing. I'll give you another kind of unusual example from history, and this is another one that I did not know about until I started doing this research. But when I present about this, I'll often ask people, okay, everyone here probably uses music streaming in some format, or that's probably where you get a lot of the music that you listen to today. When was the first company that did streaming audio? And depending on the audience I'm with, people will say like, 2008. Sometimes we'll hear people who mention something from the 1990s because they'll think, oh, there must have been some .com era startup that did that, or maybe 1980s. And if you are a little forgiving with how you define streaming, I'll call that as, you have a subscription and you do not own the music, but you are able to listen to it, as long as you're a subscriber. You could actually bring this back to the late 1800s. And there were a number of businesses that would do music by telephone. So if you can picture using very large mechanical instruments and mechanical dynamos for the electrical generation, and then transmitting that over kids. The phones were different back then. These are like, landlines, and even in a way that probably your grandparents do not remember, but like calling a number and, putting that, like receiver to your ear and like listening to very low quality, staticky, music.
It would be terrible, right?
So the funny thing is, so Mark Twain, famous author, who was actually an early adopter for a lot of technologies, maybe one of the reasons that he was almost bankrupt at various times in his life. But he listened to one of these. So like one of the companies that was doing this music streaming was called the Telharmonium. And he had this demo of listening to it and hearing the music. And he said, like his quote was, paraphrasing was, "I cannot die until I've heard this again and again and again." He was like that impressed by it. And if you kind of think about it, like we have today, of course, ways that we are also, enamored of a certain new technology. Like, something comes out, like, wow, this is just so much fun. Like, all right, I want to keep doing this again and again. Oh, this new capability comes out. Oh, I can do that. And so, back then, music was really almost entirely produced live, right? We had some early recording, like records, that were also pretty scratchy, expensive. This is before radio. So your options were either, well, you go down to the local pub and you hear like, some casual, three-piece outfit playing some music, or you play your own music, or, maybe you have an expensive phonograph record that you play, or you have something like the Telharmonium. So the alternatives were really not great back then, but the device that they would use, so these are live musicians playing, the music, but this is a device that would take like rooms of space. It was like tens of tons of equipment that was doing this, and you would get crosstalk, and like the phone companies didn't like it because they were producing so much power that the the music would like bleed over into other telephone conversations. Again, this is something that we don't think of today, but we had like we look at this example, and like there's this book written about the Telharmonium called Magical Music from the Telharmonium, about Thaddeus Cahill, the innovator of that machine. And he ran it as a business for, I want to say, about 15 years, failed ultimately. But we get that example, or at least I get that example, and I think, I had no idea this was possible.
Right.
I understand completely why it did not work as a business, but I would have had no idea. Is there something else today that it's capable to do it? Maybe I'm actually not thinking big enough or broadly enough. There is something else that's capable. Doesn't necessarily mean I want to jump in and do that, because maybe, like the Telharmonium, the business model just does not support it. But wow, maybe there are things that I'm taking it as a given, can't be done, and actually there is a way to do it. If there is maybe a very niche market that really like, there's a million Mark Twains who like really need to listen to this music for whatever reason, maybe I actually should think differently about that. But in any event, it kind of gives me this, I think, inspiration to think a little more broadly.
And I love that. What a great example. And we just weren't looking at, right? You never know what you might find. I've just got visions of these massive pieces of equipment and going, yeah, customer acquisition costs massive, but once you've bought the damn thing, you're going to use it, right? So there's a really interesting kind of relationship with the customers. And then I was thinking about the bleeding of, sort of borrowing your, borrowing your neighbor's Wi-Fi. This is fundamentally different. You're forced to listen to their choices. You're whatever your neighbors in the telephonic sense, forced to listen to their stuff on your calls as well. Super interesting. But I mean, I guess when we look at all of those things, as I look at digital businesses, obviously the cost of trying things is substantially reduced. So a counter argument to the timing thing might be, well, it's relatively easy, Paul, to find out nowadays. So why are we worrying too much about timing? And so we should just get on and do it.
You do bring up a good point, because if you are building a completely digital product, you're right. You might be able to abstract away a lot of what used to be hard asset costs years ago. Or another way to think about that is, if the main risk is, okay, is there demand for this, or is there demand at a certain price point? Could I actually run a test that is based on a mock-up of the design, or I am maybe, I'm doing in startup land, what's called a concierge MVP. Like I haven't actually built the thing. There's people behind the scenes kind of, connecting the dots, but I want to give some number of users that experience, and I want to see what they actually do. Do they come back? Do they try to pay for it? All that. So there are certainly techniques that become available if it is a purely digital service, or if I can kind of fake it and nobody has to see what's going on behind the scenes. So where I have seen people adopt this why now thinking the strongest, it's not really at the super early stage. So like the early stage startup founder, they're just going to do it. So first, even maybe in addition to what you said, is they're just passionate about this idea. You could have the most pessimistic group of investors and potential hires, like customers tell them it can't work, nobody wants it, it's not a good idea. They're still doing it. They're just in love with that idea, and that's totally fine, right? And in fact, we kind of depend on people like that to change the world, right? Like I'd say, like I am certainly not saying, hey, the world is just deterministic, so you only are going to do the things at the right time. Like there's certainly people who, because they are just so adamant at making this work out, they're going to spend the extra years, even when they're making no money and everyone thinks they're crazy. Like we kind of depend on people like that to bring many of these changes upon us. So I'm not saying like don't stop what you're doing if you don't see a timing advantage, but early stage, the founders are probably just going ahead. But this is, I think, a better fit for a couple of scenarios. So one is a startup that's at the point where maybe they want to raise, maybe it's not the initial seed capital from a more risk-tolerant angel investor, but maybe it's a little downstream for that Series A, B. Like, okay, this seems to work small scale. That next round of capital is going to be put for the growth of this business. We're talking more about, say, potential market size. We're talking more about how we can become more efficient as we grow, how we can scale this up. So if you're pitching for that type of investment, bringing in a wide owl can be, and if you do have a time advantage, that can be a good thing to add to that kind of funding discussion. In other words, to the potential investors, hey, you might have seen potential deals like this in years past, or know about examples where this didn't work in years past. This is how things are different. This is why we are going to take advantage of that. And by the way, we're also the right team, and we know what we're doing, like all of that. But so it's appropriate kind of at that little later stage startup. Or if it's at a corporate innovation lab where internally they might have any number of potential projects that they're researching, or they're kind of building prototypes for. And it's really more of a question of, hey, we have 50 things that we're working on. We need another filter on making a decision to determine where we put more resources. Timing is then another way to filter those down. So like I kind of associate it that way. And then of course on the investor side, looking at 1,000 potential deals, how do you determine the small number that you will invest in? This is another way to frame those decisions, that timing analysis. But I think there's a number of ways that you could kind of approach it, and when it's a best fit in different situations.
And it occurs to me as you're talking, if I think about patents, that's a really interesting way of dealing with potential timing issues, right? So if we look at the number of patents Apple and all the other big tech companies are registering for stuff that may or may not make it into a product, they sort of just want an option on doing that. That, as you're talking, seems to me that's a great. So you've still got the question about, do we want to spend R&D money? But we kind of want to stamp a footprint on this so nobody else can get their hands on this thing, to give ourselves the optionality to play in that space. That is in large part about timing, right? Either we're going to do it, or if we're not, we want to have the option to be able to do it. So we'll put a patent on it, and that gives us a little bit of protection as we work out whether the timing is ever going to work for us, or whether the tech works, I guess, as well.
Sure. I mean, there's also kind of predatory ways, of doing that, which, some of these large companies, maybe rightfully get accused of. But it's true. Like, okay, when am I even considering patenting. Like I wouldn't even have been thinking about this had not some other timing driver made this a capability. Or if I think, today it can't work out, but, in some number of years, this will be a market that we want to play in. Let's start to, build that defense through these patents before we actually build anything. It reminds me of, this is another historical example, but looking back at the early automotive market, and one of the jokes you'll see on the internet is, if you want to think about the potential that a disruptor has, it's not necessarily that you should look at the incumbent, because it's basically it's like sizing the market for cars against the market for horses in 1900, right? And it's funny because it's so true. So I actually, because I like doing these things, I actually went and I looked at all the numbers, like how many horses were there, in the U.S. in 1900. I have no idea, right? So I went and looked. And so, for anyone interested, there were about 20 million horses, in the U.S. in 1900, and very few cars. But it kind of gives you a perspective, like, oh, okay, well, if I'm building what is a mechanized horse, if that's the way I think of a car, maybe I should or shouldn't. Is the market size basically 20 million cars? I mean, I'm replacing all the horses. Is that really what I could grow to? And then you might think a little differently, and you might say, well, actually, the car is better than a horse. Doesn't get tired after working all day. I might be able to put seat more people in that, or pull a heavier load than I could with a horse. So maybe actually I will need fewer cars than horses that are in existence today. But then we often see something very different happen, which is, and if you follow the trend lines, the automotive market catches up to the market size for horses, if I remember right, maybe around 1920 or 25. And then it dramatically exceeds it. It wasn't capped out at that number. And this has nothing to do with a growing population. Instead, it's, wait a minute, I never had a horse because I didn't have these other needs, or like I didn't need to get get local transport and in that kind of way. But now there's this other option. I actually become a customer, whereas in the past I never would have become a customer. And then of course we also see the cost of a horse does not. I don't think there's really economies of scale associated with that. With breeding animals or raising them. But cars become dramatically less expensive over the years and better. So like we see all of a sudden timing shifts the market size. What was a market that was maybe small or pretty static, all of a sudden this becomes a much larger market or a really fast growing market. And what looked like, I don't know if this investment really makes sense, market's too small, all of a sudden it becomes like, oh wow, this is actually completely an area that we want to play in, and it's where there's going to be a lot of growth. So yeah, that timing shift the market size is another way to think about it.
And that's a really interesting example of the power of human perception, right? So we talked before about you ask people what they want and they may not know because it's difficult to assess something you've never experienced before. And that's why we sometimes struggle to put ourselves in the position of people in years gone by, because we've got our own preconceptions of the world and how it operates, and we've got knowledge of what's happened since then. A lot of the things you've looked at have a degree of predictability to them. If we look at Moore's law in technology, right, it's not scientific in the sense of it exactly worked, but he was onto something in terms of the dynamics that he was describing, and so lots of things are predictable patterns. With human perception, it's a little bit more interesting. And of course, human perception matters because we're coming back to a business is about selling a product or a service. How do you think about something like that?
Here be dragons, right? Very dangerous. So what I have found to be helpful is, so when you're looking at social and behavioral types of timing drivers, it's to identify those little communities, little niches where some group of people doing something a little different. And it's not to say, oh, well, all of those little niches become big communities eventually, but we might get some hints that there will be a social change by looking in those places. But I mean, you make a great comparison. So we have something like Moore's law, and there's various associated laws with technology. And it's not really like it's a law of the universe, right? Because there's a lot of investment that's put in, into place to keep that law going, right? Like microchip production, fabs, and research. But on the social, side, human societies, these are complex adaptive systems. The way we behave is, in fact, like if you spoke to your great-grandparents, they were alive, or if you could go back in time and talk to them, probably a lot of their attitudes and behaviors would be a little bizarre, for us today. I think that's true just about nowadays, probably just about anywhere. So I think on that like behavioral side, I would suggest going and looking for, maybe these currently existing small little niches that exist where there's some different kind of behavior going on, and then trying to determine, okay, is this something I think is going to spread and it's going to kind of become, a mass market behavior? Is this going to remain niche? Very tricky. But if the cost of doing that as an experiment is relatively low, you might say, okay, I want to maybe, play in a few of these areas. Or maybe it's a small market, but it's enough for what our business needs. But yeah, I personally, years ago, I was shocked, learning that there are these, sneakerhead communities where people like collect sneakers, and there's like limited edition sneakers. This is something I had no idea existed. And I met, a number of startups that were doing like just that, trading sneakers or putting a sneaker on the blockchain. And I thought, the world is not the world that I thought it was, right? Like this actually is something that like has rabid fans, like for like collecting, the shoes. So yeah, I would say like keep your eyes open and look around, and then decide, okay, once you identify some of these interesting niches, just, identify, do you want to play in that area, and if you think it could grow.
I think the thing's interesting as you were talking there is that because those social things they're predictable to an extent, and of course we look back and we go, well, it was clear that we could have predicted the growth of whatever it is, right? And at the time that was a bit more challenging. But I think what we do know is it can change very quickly.
Yes.
And therefore, actually, timing is not irrelevant. Timing just might operate in a different way. There may be things that take longer to adopt than you would think logically they ought to. And there are some products that just didn't work, and then suddenly it's almost the idea we may repurpose something. They've invented for A and we suddenly start using it for B and it becomes popular for B. And the whole idea of affordance. Or it may well be that things take far, far longer because we're a bit slower and we're a bit traditional and we don't like things. And so I like that idea of let's look for the rebel outposts, if you like, from a societal. There's the R&D departments of society where things might grow. And I like that idea because it doesn't mean that timing is not relevant. It makes it harder to predict. And so we have to, it seems to me, it's the same dynamic. We just have to think about it slightly differently and do not make the mistake of applying a predictable piece to that where it may not be predictable. And so we're looking at a different form, and time may compress, it may expand in ways that it wouldn't do with Moore's law, where there is and you're right, it becomes a target. It's not, you have to put an effort in, but we can sort of see where that's going. And that's what everybody is aiming towards, if not better. Social and societal change can flip at a moment's notice. Small things, we've seen that in history, right? Small things trigger revolutions. And of course, it's not that one thing. There's a whole load of other things that are there. So for me, it doesn't mean your strategy is flawed. It just means we need to look at it through a slightly different lens, recognizing that time, as it often does, presents itself in different ways, and depending on the scenario that we're in and depending on people's perception of things.
Yes, so true. And I think you probably understand that better than most, certainly. And how just behavioral considerations affect the way we make decisions, and as a result, okay, what should we be aware of? But I think that's very well put.
I'm obviously going to ask you the question, which I'm sure you've been asked. I know you've been asked this before because it's so blindingly obvious, and I've heard you answer it once before. But I'll ask it anyway, just for fun. Obviously, if we're talking about timing, your decision to write a book contains with it a presumption that this is a good time to launch it. Talk us through how you thought about doing this in terms of how did you apply your own methodology to your book?
Well, you're making one too many assumptions there. So
you have to be consistent between your behaviors.
Exactly, of course. I'm a human being. I'm not consistent at all. So like I said earlier, this timing analysis, doing a why now, kind of a study, doesn't necessarily apply to the early stage founder, right? Because they're just passionate about that. And to be honest, I became passionate about this subject. Now, I think anybody should be passionate about this subject. But I got to a point where I had run, I don't know how many of these, Why Now sessions as workshops, as talks. I'd written a number of blog posts that, I was getting feedback on. And I was in the situation where, I just wanted to do it. At this point, I just thought, like, this is going to help me learn. It's going to help me collect my thoughts. And it's also, I think, a better way, for me to share what I have learned with a broader audience. So I don't necessarily think that we're on some tipping point, where the world is all of a sudden going to say, like, oh, timing is essential. What was the name of that, that guy again?
The timing oracle. Right.
So, but for me, it was really like, I wish, so when I write, what I try to do, much of the time, apart from I want to write about what I am passionate about and what I'm curious about, is, I also think, okay, what would I have wished, or what would I have benefited from years ago when I was, say, building a company, or when I was like going through like, this kind of process. So I kind of did this in a way that I thought would help someone who was considering, okay, how are we going to survive in this, tough economic climate? Or how am I going to make a decision where I put my, my precious time and resources? Or if I'm going to, pitch for investment, how might I best tell the story, the realistic story of, why I think now is the right time for this, this type of business to exist and thrive. So that was more of my approach. Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be a revolution in, the appreciation for timing around the world, but I hope so. And I hope I could have a little part of that. But that was my approach. Yeah.
But what I think is really interesting about that is that the way ideas occur and inspirations occur and things that we get passionate about doesn't necessarily fit into a logical approach. Right? You have a need to get stuff down on the page because you think that's an important thing for you to do. It interests you. It stimulates your research, all that kind of stuff. Now, none of that is driven by a sort of business need, if you like. I don't know. I'm assuming because you're an intellectually curious person. I mean, interested in things, not strange. And so you pursue topics. And so the point is, the book was ready at that time, whether the world wanted to hear it or not. You were going to go down that particular path. And I think there's something joyous about that. And there's something really interesting that I think bringing to there's the cold nose, do I want to put money behind this project? But if I look at like something like a book, it is a ton of effort, right? We know this. Anybody that's written a book will know this is a ton of effort. So I'm not suggesting this is a sort of frivolous argument. But you look at it and say, I'm going to put some things in there. And in a way, you want this to be successful. But I'm guessing from your sort of creative, intellectual side, you just want to get this out. And so timing be damned in many respects. Right? It doesn't really matter. It's as much about having that product out there. And you know that it's going to help some people because you're having discussions with people. So the market might be small. It might not be a sustainable business in the traditional sense. If you were building Orlando timing consultants, maybe that's not the best time to do that. But that kind of doesn't matter because you're putting those ideas out there. And one of the things I think is really interesting as we look at creative endeavors going forward is that sometimes I think in that space, timing is going to be off. And actually, sometimes things out there that people don't know they love. Music's a really good example. You can have a musician that comes out with some different sound that the algorithms would have told you no one would like, and then suddenly It's like, wow, actually fantastic. And so I really like this idea in some respects that you've broken your own rules because this is not a commercial thing. You haven't sat there and said, how do I write a book that's going to make the most amount of money possible? So I really like this idea from a human perspective that you haven't given that too much thought because actually you just want this thing out there because that's more important than the optimal timing for this thing. Because I think if we wait for the optimal timing, this comes back to your founders and stars of inspiration, it may never come. There aren't going to be those perfect circumstances. Right. And so I also like in the way that you express it, which was like, I didn't really apply all that in the same way because I think that's the right answer. Otherwise, ideas like these aren't going to come out because you'll be waiting for that perfect moment and the moment may already have passed.
Well, and maybe it's the right moment in this respect. So while I was putting this together, like I mentioned, I was doing these workshops on the topic, which were a great way for me to learn. But while I was writing it, I have people who would reach out to me, on this topic, and for many of them, I'd try to have a quick call or kind of step them through the way I was thinking about it. and they would, maybe use that in their own way, and some of them would kind of check back in later on. What I've ended up doing now more recently, now that this is out, is I've discovered that people hear about it and they'll either kind of apply that, or afterwards they might get in touch with me, and then they want to kind of like talk through some element of this. But I've ended up doing what you mentioned, Orlando, timing associates or something like that.
Clock watchers or whatever.
Yes. I've ended up doing basically that that type of thing, which and for me, everything that went into that book, I feel kind of makes me now better at at doing that timing analysis or bringing someone through that process themselves. But yeah, so I one of the things I am doing is I guess really just that like advising on timing for startups and for corporates, because as we discussed there is a lot of competition today. It is a I'd say relatively uncertain economic climate. Who knows how long that lasts? And yet there's a lot of change, technological change, social change, certainly. How do we kind of collect our thoughts around all of that? So yeah, if you're listening to this, or if you've read that book and you want to talk, like I've ended up doing sessions like that.
Love it. Slightly sort of vague meta-ish question. I mean, meta as in big picture, not as in Facebook. But how has looking at time impacted your perspective on everything from your own time, mortality, all these sorts of questions? Does that come into your thinking at all? Because I would have thought that as you're focusing on the right time to do things, obviously you're thinking about time as a finite resource. And so one of the things, if it's a company, can we wait until this product is likely to be made? You have the runway to be able to do that. All these sorts of questions point towards that thing that we dare not talk about, which is the fact that we're only on this planet for a certain amount of time. That is our most limited resource in some respects. Those of us that are privileged enough to be able to feed ourselves and do those kinds of things. Has it changed your thinking about that, or is that way out there in the philosophical world?
You're asking if this is a way for me to make my own memento mori, right? Oh my. I think I had already been thinking about that type of thing, completely disconnected from this book. I am not good at, therefore, I must use every moment, in the best way. But something that I learned or maybe observed was, depending on where you live, time stretches in different ways. So, for example, I used to live in New York City. And a lot of friends, in the 10 years that I lived there, where we were all kind of like grown-up kids. Like everyone was single, like going out 7 nights a week. It felt like an extension of almost the university days. And we were all working, but like a place like that can extend that time. And you think, well, if I had lived 50 miles in just about any direction, I'd be behaving very differently. Like maybe I would be more focused on, I don't know, having children, or on like spending my time, at home instead of going out. And I think it does, affect like the environment that you are in, or the social group that you are with. It does affect the way you think about time. But, the other piece of that is just with managing distractions. So something that I've tried to consciously do, and again, I don't know if this is related to the timing research, is I've gotten to the point where I want my phone to be the least distracting, device that it can be. Obviously, I'm still getting, pinged on necessary communications, but I've removed social media, from my phone, for example. Years ago, I was a little obsessive, in checking it, on my phone. So, and I think of like, well, am I going to look back on my deathbed and say like, oh, I wish I had spent another hour on Twitter? Like, I don't think it's going to happen, right? Nobody's going to say that. So yeah, I think, for everyone, and this is why I always appreciate talking to you, because you ask these questions that really make you think. We all might just consider, you're right. We are only here for a limited amount of time. Don't bet on, radical life extension, anytime soon, in which case you don't have to pay any attention to, thinking about your time on Earth, right? But like, what would you want to be, doing today if, you knew that, okay, not many days are left. So yeah, that is a interesting question to reflect on.
I love that so much in that answer. As ever, and I always say this at the end of the show, but of course in this show, particularly over time, Paul, when I speak to you, just flies, because there's so many interesting things, so many avenues and rabbit holes I would love to dive down. So you will clearly be invited to come back onto the show to talk further as you explore this journey. My sense is that you're not done with this topic. You're not done with unintended consequences. There'll be a load more things coming out of the Orlando Brain Factory, which I would love to share with my listeners at a future date. But before I let you go, remind people what the book is called. You can obviously tell them where they get hold of it. I think it's obvious, but let's do that anyway, just for fun's sake.
Sure. The book is called Why Now? How Good Timing Makes Great Products. You can find it on Amazon. And yeah, I hope for anyone who reads it, you get as much value as I did, when I put it all together. And like I said, happy having a follow-up discussion for people who are really interested in the topic.
Amazing. Well, I can highly recommend it. As people can detect, it's thoughtful, it's clear, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking. And as ever, Paul, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed the book, so it comes highly recommend. And I'd say, actually, I think it's worth reading, even if you are not an investor in or running a business or any of those sorts of things. I just think thinking that's gone into it, as we said at the start, you're asking it's very simple questions. And I love your modesty that sort of says, well, there's nothing sophisticated about this. You could probably have got there yourself if you'd spent the time. The magic of what you do is that you have spent the time and you've thought about it and distilled it. But I think these are some really important questions. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is to read it, both in the context of how I run my business, but also as I help people to think about the time horizons for the projects and things that I'm working with clients on there. But I think there's something more as well about how we live our lives and that personal question. And so one of the things for me is there's a lot of inspiration there. I don't look at every single thing I do as a business investment in my time, because there's a ton of really fun things that I would never have done if I thought in those terms. We don't want to get that far. But I do think that the processes that we go through about where we're spending our time, how we're spending it, who we're spending it with, is this the right moment to be doing this? Just even the conversation, is this the right moment to point something out to someone? Right. Or is it unhelpful, right? Should I find a different moment to say it? I think all of those thoughts occurred to me as I was reading it as well. So just for that reason alone, let alone for the tons of people that will find it useful for their investments or their businesses, comes highly, highly recommended. All that remains for me to say, Paul, is thank you so much, as ever, for inspiring, making me smile, making me laugh, and for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thanks so much, Christian. Wonderful speaking with you again.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Paul for appearing. To find out more about Paul, his book, Why Now? How Good Timing Makes Great Products, his research, and his previous appearance on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like this episode or the series as a whole, please do leave us a review. It helps others to find the show. And to discover episodes of it that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Think about how timing might impact your own projects or decisions. Take a moment to reflect on the right time to act. But above all, thank you so much for listening.